Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Mishnah Mastery. We are going to be starting tonight in Masechet Shekalim, chapter 4, Perek Daled. So we are going to get it on the screen. Can you guys all see it already on Zoom?
Yes.
Brilliant. And we're going to get it for you over here. And some exciting stuff tonight. Going to see the world of the Beit HaMikdash a little bit later. If we can, we'll try and plow through 3 chapters. How about that? All in the 15 minutes of halftime. Let's see if we can do it. Okay, chapter 4, going to be looking at what was done with all the different donations. We've been talking about the money that had to be taken as annual donations. What did they do with it? Let's find out. Mishnah Aleph, the first Mishnah of the chapter. Hatruma me hayu osin ba. What did they do with all the donations? With the mainstay of the money that was collected. What did they do with it? Let's have a look. Says the Mishnah, Lokchin ba tamidin umusafim miniskehem. They would use that money to buy the animals needed for the tamid offerings, the public daily offerings that were brought twice a day, the musafin, the additional offerings that were brought on Shabbos and Rosh Chodesh and Yom Tovim, miniskehem, and as well they would bring we use the word libations, the additional supplements that were brought along with each korban. What else would they bring? Well, first of all, Niskehem, let's just flesh that out a little more. That was the flour, the oil, and the wine that was brought with all public Ola sacrifices and all private Ola sacrifices and all shlamim. So these supplements were also purchased with that money. Says the Mishnah, Ha'omer, the Korban Omer, which was brought on second day Pesach, Ushtei Halechem, the 2 loaves that were brought on Shavuos, the Lechem Hapanim, and the weekly showbreads, the 12 loaves that were put on the Shulchan in the temple, they were bought with those communal funds. The Chol Korbanos HaSibur, and any public offering that was brought would be purchased using the funds that were collected. Says the Mishnah, Shomrei Safichim Bashviis Notlin Sacharan Mitrumas Halishka. When it came to Shavuos, when it came to the 7th year of every 7-year cycle, a time when produce was meant to be hefka, so there were people who would guard the shoots of the wheat and the barley as they were growing, and they would need to be paid. So says the Mishnah, Notlin Sachar Mitrumas Halishka. These guards were paid with the donations, with the funds of the lishka, of the chamber. So in order to ensure that that these guards would do nothing to acquire the wheat that was growing, because it had to be a publicly funded korban, so therefore he had to be paid in order to avoid any issues of making these things under the ownership of somebody. Rabbi Yossi Omer, Rabbi Yossi says, Af harotze misnadev shomer chinam. Rabbi Yossi says, if a man wanted to, he could volunteer to watch and not accept payment. Amrullah, but they said back to him, Afata Omer she'enan bayin ela mishal tzibur. But you too would say, you would agree that they can only be offered out of public funds. And so therefore, to avoid any uncertainty, any doubt, any risk that these hefka, ownerless grains would now be unsuitable for temple use, therefore they ensured that they gave some kind of compensation to these guards to make sure that they could use it in the Shavuos year. Whew! Okay, guys, Mishnah base. Second Mishnah says the Mishnah as follows: Para v'sayer hamishtaleach. The para aduma. That's what we're talking about when we say the para. Sayer hamishtaleach, which we all know from what day was Yom Kippur? Was it yesterday? Oh my gosh, time Oh, wow. So as we all know from only yesterday, the the Se'ira Mishtaleach, the goat that was sent away for Azazel, the Lashon Shel Zahoris, and the thread, the strand of red wool, Bain Mitruma Salishka, that would be purchased using the funds that were collected. Kevesh Para, the ramp for the Para Aduma, which was basically created a route to ensure that the Para Aduma could not be contaminated with ritual impurity. The Kevesh Sa'ir HaMishtaleach, and similarly the boards and the ramps that were needed to ensure that the goat for Azazel, the scapegoat, that's the word I was looking for, to ensure that the scapegoat did not become contaminated. Velashon shebein karnav, and the thread of red wool that was between its horns. Va'amas hamayim, the trough, the ditch, the drain that ran through the temple courtyard. In order to keep that maintained. V'chomas ha'ir, and the walls of the city, umigdaloseha, and the towers. V'chol sarchei ha'ir, any public demand, any public need for maintenance, for repairs, whatever it needs. Bayin mishiarei halishka, that would come from the remainder of all of the money after they had paid for what they needed to with the funds to fund the korbanos. That would be used for all of these public needs. Abba Shaul Omer, Kevesh Para Kohanim Gedolim Osin Asom Mishal Atzman. Abba Shaul said that the high priests would take the responsibility to fund the ramps for the Para Aduma, the ramps for the Para Adumas, for the red heifers. They would pay for that off their own funds, their own money. Especially since they were the ones that would process the Para Aduma and take responsibility for it. So they also took financial responsibility for it, according to Abba Shaul. Mishnah Gimel. Mosar Sheyarei Halishka. Let's scroll down. What did they do with the leftovers, the surplus from the Sheyarei Halishka, from the remainder of the for the money that was collected? So after they have now bought all of their korbanos, after they've now invested that money in any other public needs, fixing up the city, etc., what would they use it for? What would they use it for? They would use it to buy up a store of wine, and oil and flour. And the profit would belong to the temple. This is the opinion of Rabbi Yishmael. They essentially opened up a shop, a little markolet in the Beis Hamikdash for people to be able to come and buy these additional things that they may have needed to bring with their sacrifices. Rabbi Akiva Omer, Ein mistakrin mishel hekdesh v'lo mishel aniyim. Rabbi Akiva says one may not make a profit with property belonging to the temple, nor with property belonging to the poor. He says you can't do business with hekdesh or with money from tzedakah, and that's, I think, in part due to the risk that these things may go down in value, and then the Beis Hamikdash will end up making a loss rather than a profit. Continues the Mishnah in Mishnah Daled, Mosar Teruma. The leftovers that were left over in the stucker boxes, in the kupot, in the collection boxes at the next Rosh Chodesh Nisan, right? Remember we said that they would start to collect in Adar, so that it would all be ready for use in the Rosh Chodesh Nisan, at the beginning of Nisan. So you're now going to have a brand new collection the following year to be able to buy new korbanos. So what do you do with any leftover money that is still remaining? Says the Mishnah, Mehayu Oisenba, what would you do? Says the Mishnah answers, Rikue Zahav Tzipui Leveis Kodshe HaKadoshim. The Mishnah says as follows: they would use it to buy plates of gold to be able to cover the interior of the Kodesh HaKadoshim. Rabbi Yishmael says, Mosar haperot lekayitz hamizbeach. Rabbi Yishmael says the leftover money from the sale of fruits was used lekayitz hamizbeach, was used, it translates it there as the altar's dessert. The altar's dessert. Anyone want to help me out here with the altar's dessert? No? Pardon me?
Waiting for you.
Waiting for me.
Doesn't really give an explanation of it.
Oh, that's beautiful.
We used to buy communal offerings for the dessert of the altar, all offerings that are brought on days when few offerings are being brought. So the altar doesn't left over.
Used to buy ministering vessels.
But these extra offerings are called the dessert of the altar because they are brought after all the days of regular offerings that have been made. Yeah.
So I guess in the same way that we treat ourselves to dessert at the end of a meal, there was a way of treating the altar to additional sacrifices.
Yeah. So it's not left over.
Aha. Oh, okay. So if no one was bringing that day, then they would have funds to be able to bring at least something. Is that right?
Exactly.
Brilliant. All right. Awesome. I'm glad we got that one sorted. Whew. And continues the Mishnah. So most of our parents that would be used to fund these additional offerings that would go on the altar. And anything else would be used to fund the purchase of different vessels to be able to bring the various korbanot in. So you might need bowls and tools and all these kinds of things. So anything that was used in the service in the temple, they would be purchased with these funds. Rabbi Akiva says, Mosar ha-teruma l'kayitz hamizbeach. Anything left over from the teruma, from this money that was not used, that would be used for the kayitz hamizbeach, for this altar's dessert. And Mosar nesachim, and anything left over from the funds needed to buy the nesachim that we've talked about, the supplementary ingredients for a korban, that money was used to purchase the bowls and tools and appliances that was used in the service of the korban. Rabbi Chananya Sagan HaKohanim Omer, Rabbi Chananya, the Sgan, the chief of the priests, says, Mosar nesachim l'kayitz hamizbeach. The leftovers of the nesachim was used to fund these dessert offerings. Umosar ha-teruma l'kli sharos. And the leftovers of the money that was collected by Rosh Chodesh Nisan, that money was used to purchase the appliances and the tools. Zeva zeh lo hayu modim b'peres. And fundamentally, we see that there is some kind of agreement, but they don't agree to using money from the sale of produce to be able to fund things. So that's where the difference lies between those otherwise very similar opinions. Continues the Mishnah in Mishnah Hey, Mosar hakatores, the leftover ingredients that was used to create the incense offering, the different powders, the different herbs, the different spices that were used to create this mixture. Mehayu osinba. What was that used for? So the Mishnah tells us, Mafrishin mimena sechar ha'umonin. They would separate from the ingredients something to be able to pay the craftsmen. They were it was a very talented family who we'll mention a bit later on tonight. But this family was in charge of maintaining and keeping secret the ingredients and the recipe for creating the incense offering, so they would need to be paid. And they would exchange it. Is that right? Have I got that right so far? Yeah. And then so they would then exchange it and deconsecrate it. And then they would give that money for to those people that were in charge of the Ketores. And then they would buy it back again using the temple funds. So what's happening at the end of this? What are they ending up with? They're ending up with money. Yeah, so they would give the ingredients to the craftsmen, and then they
back with the new Teruma fund.
Yeah. So the Beis Hamikdash is now left with ingredients for the Ketores, and the family that were in charge of the Ketores are left with money.
Yeah.
I think that's right. In Baheh Chadash Bizmano, but if the new month arrived in time for this whole process to take place, then Lokhin Osa Mitruma Chadasha, they would buy it using the new funds. V'imlav min hayishana, and if it had not arrived yet, if the money had not yet started to be used, then they would use the older funds, the leftover funds, to be able to do that whole process. Whew, that's a tricky one. Wrap your head around that. Mishnah Vav. Mishnah Vav. Let's scroll down a little bit. It says the Mishnah, Hamakdish nechasav v'hayu bahen devarim re'uin lekarbanos hatzibur. A person who sanctifies his possessions to the temple, consecrates them, and he owned items which are actually fitting to be used for public sacrifices. So let's just say he owns a whole bunch of assets, and he decides to dedicate all of them to the temple. If there's any flour, if there's any animals, if there's any oil, wine, whatever it is, that can be used for public offerings, says the Mishnah, Yinasnu le'umanim b'scharam divrei Rabbi Akiva. So these things can be given to the craftsmen as their wages, in the opinion of Rabbi Akiva. Amar lo Ben Azai says, Enohi Amida. This is not the right way to go about it. Ela mafrishin mehen schar ha'umanin. Rather, what they need to do is they have to separate the wages for the craftsmen, umechalel inosan al ma'as ha'umanin, and then they have to exchange it for the money that was due to be paid to the craftsman. And that gets given to the craftsmen. And then that goes and gets bought back again out of the new funds. So that the Beis Hamikdash end up with things that they can use, and the craftsmen end up being paid with what they need, and everything is hunky-dory. Mishnah Zayin. Says the Mishnah, Hamakdish nechasav, one who consecrates and sanctifies and dedicates his items for temple usage, and he owns an animal that is fit to be brought on the sacrifice, Zacharim and Nekevus, whether it's male or female. Rabbi Eliezer says, Zacharim yimachu letzarchei olos, the male animals can be sold for the use of olah sacrifices, and the female animals can all be sold in order to be able to be used for shlamim sacrifices. And then the value of these things, the money, can then be sent for the upkeep of the Beis Hamikdash. Rabbi Yehoshua Omer, Rabbi Yehoshua says, Zacharim atzman yikarvu olos. Rabbi Yehoshua says, the males themselves, you can actually use so I've missed a bit. Rabbi Eliezer was saying that the money generated by selling these things gets used for the sacrifices. Rabbi Yehoshua says the actual animals can be brought. The males can be brought for an olah, and the females get sold, and then the money from the sale goes towards those for the shlamim. The yavi b'dmeihem olas, and then they use the money that they've earned from selling the females. They use that money to then bring olos instead of Rabbi Eliezer's opinion. And the rest of the assets get sold on or get used for the upkeep of the Beis Hamikdash. Rabbi Akiva has another opinion over here. Roa ani es divrei Rabbi Eliezer min divrei Rabbi Yehoshua. Rabbi Akiva says, I prefer the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer over the opinion of Rabbi Yehoshua. Rabbi Eliezer hishvares midasa, because according to Rabbi Eliezer, he is, as it says there, he's applying a uniform rule. Rabbi Yehoshua chalak, but Rabbi Yehoshua is differentiating between the males and the females as to what they get used for. So Rabbi Akiva was holding like Rabbi Eliezer because I guess it was just a more clean-cut approach as to what you do with these sacrifices. Amar Rabbi Papias. Rabbi Papias, we've never encountered him before, I don't think. Shamati kedivrei shnehem. Rabbi Papias said, I've actually heard the opinion being like both of these opinions. Shehamakdish beferush, a person who explicitly dedicates his assets to the Beis Hamikdash, kedivrei Rabbi Eliezer, then we act in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer. V'hamakdish stam, if a person just consecrates his items without specifying explicitly what these things need to be done with, then the halacha, according to Rabbi Papias, kedivrei Rabbi Yehoshua, then the halacha is going to go like Rabbi Yehoshua. Continuing with Mishnah Ches, hamakdish nechasim, a person who dedicates his assets, his possessions to the Beis Hamikdash. And there are things there that can be fit for use on the altar. Yenos, wine, shmani va'ofos, oils and birds. Rabbi Elazar says, Yimachu l'tzarchei osan hamin v'yavi b'dmehen olos, u'sh'ar nachasim yiplu l'bedek havayis. Says Rabbi Elazar, they can be sold for the use of the offerings of each particular kind, and then they should bring the values for the proceeds for olos, for burnt offerings, and then everything else, all the other possessions, would then be dedicated to the upkeep of the Beis Hamikdash. Whew. Any questions so far? Okay. Either you're doing a good job or I am. Says the Mishnah of Mishnah Test, the last Mishnah of chapter 4. It would seem that the prices were set with suppliers once every 30 days. So says the Mishnah, Achas l'shloshim yom, once every 30 days, Mesharim es halishka. They would fix the price on behalf of the Lishka, on behalf of the Beis Hamikdash. Kol mekabel alav l'sapek salasos me'arba. Anyone who agrees to supply the flour, the soles, me'arba, and he agrees to sell it, to supply it at 4 se'ah for every selah. So selah is a unit of currency. Se'ah is a unit of volume. So anyone that would agree to supply the flour at a rate of 4 se'ah for the price of a selah, amdu mishalosh, if the market now really was standing at 3 se'ah for the price of 1 selah, so the value is going, you're getting less for your money, which means the value is increasing, right? The currency is getting stronger, and now you're getting less for your money. Yisapek me'arba, nonetheless, because the Beis Hamikdash always has to win, you still have to supply at the price that you had agreed. Mishalosh va'amdu me'arba, if you had agreed to supply 3 se'ah of flour for the price of a selah, va'amdu me'arba, and now the market drops, the value drops, so now you can get, now you would be selling, the market would be selling flour at the rate of 4 se'ah for every seller. Yisapek me'arba. Nonetheless, you have to now give the Beis Hamikdash 4 se'ah. Even though you had agreed to sell them 3, you have to give them 4. Why? Sheyad hekdesh al ha'elyona. The temple has to always have the upper hand. Ve'im, says the Mishnah, and if hisliya soles, if the flour becomes wormy, becomes contaminated with worms, then hisliya lo, the loss of this flour belongs to the supplier, not to the Beis Hamikdash. V'im hechmitz yayin, if the wine turns sour, hechmitz lo, then the wine seller has to accept that loss upon himself. Ve'eno mekabel es me'osav ad she'yehei hamizbeach meratzeh, and he is not able to take payment until the mizbeach meratzeh, until the altar has accepted, meaning until the Beis Hamikdash is ready to process these transactions. Only then is the money able to change hands, and the supplier is able to get the money that they had been waiting for. Mazel tov, everybody, on finishing chapter 4. All right, let's have a look now at some of the people. This is great. This is amazing. This is all amazing, but amazing to see some of the stuff that we've got coming now. 15 permanent jobs that were in the Beis Hamikdash. For some of these names, there's a machlokes as to whether these were individuals' names or whether this was the title, the name that you were given if you were allocated one of these positions. But let's check them out. These are the officers that worked in the Beis Hamikdash. These were the people that had permanent jobs in the Beis Hamikdash. Says the Mishnah, Yochanan ben Pinchas al Hachosamos. Yochanan, the son of Pinchas, was appointed as the officer over the seals, not those seals, but of the other seals. Achia was appointed al Hanasachim. He was in charge of the libations, of those supplementary additional parts, components that were brought with sacrifices. Matisya ben Shmuel al Hapiasos. Matisya, the son of Shmuel, was in charge of the lotteries to determine which kohen would be given each job each day. Pesachia al Hakinin. Pesachia was in charge of the kinin, the bird offerings, the pairs of birds. And the Mishnah tells us fascinatingly, Pesachia ze Mordechai. This was actually the position that Mordechai held. Lama nikra shemo Pesachia. So why does the Mishnah call him Pesachia? Shahaya poseach bidvarim v'dorsham v'yodea shivim lashon. The Mishnah tells us because he would open up matters and he would expound, he would teach them and explain them, and he knew all the 70 languages of the world. Ben Achia was appointed al Chole Me'ayim. He was in charge of taking care of any Kohanim who felt unwell. Nechunya Chofer Shichin. Nechunya was in charge of digging ditches. Gavine was in charge of Charoz, and he was the crier. He was the announcer, the person that would announce anything that needed to. He was the warden who did the announcements at the end of the service. Ben Gever, what did Ben Gever do? Al Ilas Sha'arim. He was in charge of Nila. He was in charge of closing the gates at the end of the day. Ben Bevai al Apakia. Ben Bevai was in charge of the braiding when there were worn out clothes from the Beis Hamikdash, from the Kohanim serving in the Beis Hamikdash. They would take the fibers of the garments and they would turn them into wicks for the menorah. Ben Arza al Hatzil Tzal. Ben Arza was in charge of the orchestra. He was in charge of all the people who played. I'm sorry?
I've got something different for Ben Beneva.
What have you got?
I've got Ben Beneva was responsible for the whip, but he would walk through the temple each night to make sure none of the guards fell asleep.
Ah.
It's different.
Also an important job.
Sorry, I just saw your phone.
Oh yeah, that's what the Bartanura says as well. Yeah. But the Talmud Yerushalmi, it seems, explains that it was the person who would turn the clothes into wicks. So I guess there's a dispute. Bartanura says it's the guy who kept everyone awake at night, and the Talmud Yerushalmi tells us that it's the person that turned the clothes into wicks. Thank you for that. Ben Arza al Atzil Tzal. Ben Arza was in charge of the music. Hugra, he was the DJ. Hugras ben Levi Hugras ben Levi al-Hashir, he was in charge of the singers. Beis Garmu al-Masa lechem apanim. The family of Beis Garvu were in charge of the ingredients and guarding the recipe to make the showbreads. And it was a secret. It was a family trade, family tradition as to how to get that perfect shape. Beis Avtinas al-Maseh HaKatores, as we were alluding to before, the family of Avtinas were in charge of guarding the secrets and the recipe for how to make the incense. And fascinating stories about when they tried to allocate these responsibilities to other people, and it all goes pear-shaped. I can't remember where the Gemaras are, but they're fascinating to see. Elazar ala parochos. Elazar was in charge of the curtains, and finally Pinchas ala malbush. And Pinchas was in charge of the clothing, making sure that everyone had what they needed. Says the Mishnah in Mishnah base, Ein Pochasin, and this is good as well because we were talking about this last week. I think Philip asked the question. Ein Pochasin Mishlosha Gizbaru and Mishiva Amar Kalim. So they did not have less than 3 treasurers, and they did not have less than 7 people in charge of the storage houses. This was a higher position. Translates it there as a superintendent. They were in charge of the storage houses. Ve'ein osin shorara ala tzibur b'mamon pachos mishnayim. And positions of authority were not allocated unless there were at least 2 people when it was a matter of public money. Chutz miben achia she'al chole me'ayim ve'elazar she'al parochas, with the exception of Achia, who was in charge of the unwell Kohanim, and Elazar, who was in charge of the curtains, she'osan kiblu rovat sibur alehem, because they were individuals who had been accepted and were trusted to do their positions, and so I guess even though they were using public funds to make expenditures, they trusted them to not do anything untoward. Says the Mishnah in Mishnah Gimel. Arba chosamos hayu b'mikdash. There were 4 different types of seals in the Beis HaMikdash. V'chasuv aleihem egel zachar gadi and chayte. And there were 4 titles that were written on these seals. One was calf, one was ram, one was kid, and one was sinner. Says the Mishnah. What am I missing again? I wanted to make a point, but I can't remember what I wanted to say. La 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 la. Okay, I'm not sure what I wanted to say. So 4 seals in the Beis HaMikdash, and on them were written Egel Zachar Gadi and Chayte. On them were written we're in the wrong place. Calf, ram, kid, and sinner. Ben Azai Omrim Chamisha Hayu. There were 5. The Aramis Kasav Aleim, and they were written in Aramaic. Egel Zachar Gadi, so the same 3. But then the Chote, the sinner ones, were divided into 2. Chote Dal and Chote Ashir. Chote for the super package. So I mean, okay, let's try and understand this a little bit. Gadi refers to a 1-year-old sheep, male and female. The Zachar refers to a 2-year-old ram, and all of these supplementary things that were brought, the different flowers, the oils, the wines. Egel refers to the cows, the 3-year-old cows, and everything that came with that. And then for the Chote, so there were 2 different types of packages. There was the super package for those who had the money, and that would include animals and the libations. And the Chote Dal was the package that was there for people that didn't have the money. And so that was a smaller package for people. I think this is talking about mutsoras, people who were lepers, people who were afflicted with soras. So when they would bring their sacrifices, there were two different levels depending on their wealth, and so a wealthier person would bring 3 animals, and a poorer person would bring 1 animal with all the supplementary libations. Says the Mishnah. I've missed a bit, haven't I? Egel Meshamesh in this case Bakar Gadolim Ukatanim Zacharim and Akevos. So the calf, right? The calf seal would serve for the libations of cattle, Gadolim Ukatanim, large and small, male and female. Gedi, the seal for the kids, for the goats. Meshamesh in this case, son Gadolim Ukatanim, Zacharim and Akevos, Chutz Mishal Elim. So they would serve for the libations of sheep, large and small, male and female, with the exception of rams. And Zachar Meshamesh in this case, Elim Bilvad, the one that was inscribed with the word ram, that would serve for the libations of rams alone. Chote Meshamesh in this case, Shalosh Behemos Shal Mitzrayim. And then the one that was inscribed with sinner would be used for the libations of the 3 animals for a Mitzorah. That's according to the first position in the Mishnah. And as we said, according to Ben Azai, where there were 5, because they split the wealthier Chote and the poorer Chote, they would have served different purposes. Says the Mishnah in Mishnah Daled, Mishu Mevakesh Nesachim, a person who is needing to process Nesachim, Holech Lo Eitzel Yochanan, Shehu Mamune Ala Chosamos, he would go to Yochanan, who was the officer over the seals. I guess you could say these are more like receipts, I'm not sure. So he would go to this guy, Yochanan, Nosen Lamaos Mekabel Memenu Chosam. He would go to Yochanan, he would give him the money for the libations, and then he would get a chosam, he would get one of these seals. Balo Eitzel Achia, then he would go to Achia, Shehu Mamuna ala Nesachim, who was in charge of the distribution of all of these Nesachim of the libations. V'nosen lo chosam Mekabel Memenu Nesachim. He would give his receipt, he would give his seal, and then he would get the Nesachim in question. V'la Erev, Ba'in Zeh Etzel Zeh, and in the evening the two would come together. That's Achia and Yochanan. V'Achia motzi asachosamos mekabel kenegdan maos. And Achia would take out all of his seals that he had been given to then distribute the libations, and they would compare it against the money that had come in. V'im hosiru lehekdesh. Any surplus would be given to the Beis Hamikdash. V'im pachasu, and if there was a discrepancy between the money taken and the seals which had been handed in, then Yochanan would have to pay out of his own pocket. Because as we said before, the temple always had to have the upper hand. So if there was a discrepancy between the money that had been taken in and the amount of libations that would have been given out and distributed, so then it would have been Yochanan who would bear the brunt of that expense. Says the Mishnah, hey, Misha Avad Mimenu Chasama, a person who loses his seal, he loses his receipt, Mamtinin Lo Ada Erev, so he has to wait until the evening. Imotz Lo Kadei Chasama, if they find money left over in the coffers that is equal to the amount that he had in theory given, Noslin Lo, then they give him that money. Ve'im Lav Lo Haya Lo, and if not, then he loses out. V'Shem Hayom Kasuv Aleihim Ibnei HaRama'in, and each day they would make sure to write on the seals, on the receipts, what the date was, so that there was no way of defrauding the system. So I'm starting to understand this a little bit more now. So the 4 or 5 different seals were the seals that when people would go and pay their way in the Beis Hamikdash, they would get these seals, and then they would use that to get their flour, their oil, their their wine, whatever it was. That's what they would be getting with those seals when they took it to Achia. Says the Mishnah, Shtei lashachos hayu b'mikdash. There were two chambers in the Beis Hamikdash. Achas lishkas chashayim. One was, I've got it translated here as the quiet, the room of the quiet, the chamber of the quiet. It says it there on the screen as the chamber of secret gifts. Va'achas lishkas hakelim, and the other was known as the chamber of the vessels. Lishkas chashayim yireichet nosnin lasoicha b'chashayim. With the chamber of secret gifts, then very God-fearing individuals would give their gifts, I guess, in secret. And then poor people would be secretly supported with that, with those contributions. Lishkas hakelim, the chamber of the vessels. Anybody who would donate a vessel, would be put into that chamber. Once every 30 days, the treasurers would open up the chamber. And any chamber, any kli, any vessel that was in there, that was found in there, that could be put to use in the Beis Hamikdash, they would put it to use in the Beis Hamikdash. And anything else, and anything else would then be sold for other things, and that money would then be used for funding the repairs of the Beis Hamikdash. Mazel tov on completing chapter 5. Shkoyach Rabbi Isai. Do we want to go one more? I don't know if I can do it or not. I didn't get to my map. What a shame. No, we'll save it for next week because I don't think I can necessarily get through it. Actually, maybe I could. What do you think? Pardon me?
It's up to you.
It's up to. Oh, don't say it's up to me. I don't like that kind of pressure. 6, 7, and 8. Let's leave the. Let's try and plow through 3 chapters next week. We'll call it a night tonight, and please God, next week we'll get the maps out because we see some of the gates and some of the different things that are going on. So we'll do that next week. In which case, I will wish you all mazel tov on completing 2 chapters tonight, and join us again next week when we'll please God try and finish Masechet Shekalim together. So in the meantime, have a wonderful and meaningful night.